47 degrees. Dave Diamond along with Jim Ellis. Another check on traffic and weather coming up. I know Phil's got some guests in the studio, so let's get back into it. Back to the Phil Cowan program, AM 1380, The Answer.
Thank you, Dave. We do have guests in the studio, 5 minutes past 8. And our guest this hour, and continuing with some more candidate interviews, Andrew Grant, who joined us on the phone here. Gosh, it's been, what, a month ago or more?
feels like longer.
It does feel like longer. It has been a while.
Good to see you, Phil.
Who is a Republican running for Congress in District 7, currently occupied by Dr. Ami Bera. And you and I, when we spoke, we mostly talked about business issues because you were involved in Northern California World Trade Center, which I mentioned at the time. I didn't know we had one here in Northern California.
Quietly doing good work for the community.
Well, and it is
Important
quiet,
work.
but, a World Trade Center makes sense in California.
Yep.
We have plenty of goods and services that are being sold around the world. Before we move on to some other issues, and since our last couple of congressional interviews, both with one of your opponents and with the young man who's challenging Tom McClintock, Senator, around health care, we'll get to that in a minute, too. But first, regarding President Trump and the job that he's doing in trying to renegotiate and get better international trade deals for American businesses, in principle, I certainly am opposed to any kind of hard tariffs. And at the time, my position was, I'm not sure that's really his goal here. I think he's looking for a hammer because he wants a better deal. There's something he wants, and that's the leverage he's going to use. And it certainly appears to be playing out that way. But what's your position on what the president is doing in trying to renegotiate NAFTA or get a better deal from China for TPP?
So the president had to do what he's doing. I firmly believe that. It's frustrating.
You think America was kind of getting a raw deal in some of these?
Well, look at the World Trade Organization and look at how many arbitration cases we have against them for things like dumping steel into Mexico and then selling it through NAFTA. Those are examples to where China claims to be supporters of free trade and enterprise, and yet at the same time, when we use what is the established order by which we try to adjudicate causes for them taking advantage of the system, it's not enforced. And how many years do we do that before he finally says, you know what, somebody has to, like you described, take this with a hammer and emphasize the importance of real free trade. And if you don't do something about it, then I'm going to do something about it and take it into my own hands. So there's a negotiation tactic here, but I think someone had to, and I think he is frustrated by how little is done. I think Lighthizer position on trying to find a way to improve the amount of American content through NAFTA, for example, is another example of, well, you know what, we might get a better deal. We might sell more coming from America versus from Mexico or Canada. And if it improves by 5%, if it improves by 10% in terms of the content manufactured in the U.S. versus other places, it's a better deal. So I think he's going into each of these with an open mind, but using some strength and negotiation tactics to try to get us to a better place.
Well, and I feel like previous administrations shied away from being rougher negotiators than they could have been.
They absolutely did. They came from almost a position of what I describe as more like treaty brokering, which is to say that you put exactly what you want at the end of the day up front. And then what happens, of course, is it's marginalized, it's deminimized, right, through the process. Whereas what he's saying is, no, in negotiations, you come in some extreme cases and you say, here's what we're looking at.
You ask
and
for the moon.
And if you find a way for a compromise,
yeah.
Look, his tax reform example is the perfect case. He was trying to push down into the teens for what the corporate rate would look like, right?
Oh yeah, and a radical simplification of the code.
Ended up
he went
at
off,
21%.
Yeah.
And he said, you know what? I'm good with this. I'll bet you he would have been good, and shame on other people who wanted it to be raised, to pay for other things. I'm glad they didn't, but shame on them that they didn't push for a little more, because I think he would have been pleased with 23, 24, 25% if that's what you wanted. Now, I'm happy where it's at, but that's just how he negotiates. And so I see all this as part of the overall negotiation process that President Trump brings to the government, and I think it's a good thing.
Okay. Let's talk about health care for a minute, because it's been a big topic of discussion, and obviously it's a topic of the serious concern to every American right now. From your perspective, well, what's the best solution to the problem that we have right now? Is it a more free market-based approach? How should we deal with people getting affordable access to health care in the United States?
Well, to answer your question around free market, yes, there has to be a larger element of the free market into the decisions we're making for care for patients. It has to be a more patient-centric and patient decision-making process involved with what our healthcare looks like for the future. It's not right now. Here's what happened. There's a bunch of stakeholders in the healthcare industry who are all making a lot of money. And that is everyone who's involved in that industry. Pharmaceuticals, the insurance companies, the providers, the doctors, the nurses, the facilities themselves, the administrators. They're all part of making a lot of money really at the expense of Americans, and in many respects with the more federal dollars especially, but also state dollars going into providing care at the expense of taxpayers.
Well,
They're all involved and all responsible.
Yeah, and the idea, and I said it at the time, when Obamacare, when the Affordable Care Act was being negotiated, and well, there wasn't much of a negotiation when it was passed, was wow. They kept talking about how they were going to hold Big Pharma accountable and they were going to hold insurance companies accountable. All they did was kind of corner the market for these big stakeholders, and they've driven competition away.
So if you're trying to market your facility and you want someone to come and be provided care there, you're going to ask for investments for the latest technology. That investment's going to come from institutional investors, Wall Street. It's going to come from the providers themselves. It's going to come from a lot of places. Now you have to pay for it and see a return on that investment. So who's involved in that process? Who's involved in saying, okay, instead of doing something that could be cheaper but still satisfy the patient's needs, we're going to force you into this facility, force you into this particular procedure that costs more, but it pays back on that return that all of us have invested in. I think that's the vicious cycle that we're dealing with. And right now, most people are just worried about trying to sort of keep things alive. The idea of this mandate and stabilizing using federal tax dollars, that's just a way to sort of stabilize this process that's been in place that has been lucrative for a lot of people inside the healthcare community, but at the expense of everyone else. And so we need to find a way to break that up and make sure the patient is more involved in their healthcare choices, which can often be a cheaper procedure, a cheaper drug decision than what they're first being able to or being forced to decide on now.
Do we, in this country, do you think, have a monopoly on at the hospital level in healthcare right now?
Oh, I do. I think there's a strong monopoly that's going on there. And I think the way
you really don't have many choices. And in a lot of communities, especially if it's a smaller community, you have one choice.
There are some real sad cases. And in fact, it's not often that I would give credit to the state of California for presenting this in a lawsuit or a concern around what's coming from the state in terms of an investigation. But this recent lawsuit by Becerra actually, I think, pinpoints a real issue dealing with Sutter Health. Sutter Health right now, in the regionalization program that they have designed, have come in and basically gobbled up a lot of care and a lot of facility operations across Northern California. And there's been specific doctors who have said, I'm concerned because my local care, my care that my patients have been receiving from my facility, from my ward for years, is no longer available here, and we're being forced into more expensive and more distant facilities through this regionalization program. And I think there's a real concern there. And there's a lot of doctors who are concerned about that, but there's also certainly the patients who also can't see those costs. People go in to get a procedure done, and they're being told, okay, you have to go to this facility, you're required to do it. They find out later on their bill how much that cost when there could have been options to go and get something done at a different location for far cheaper. And so there's a transparency issue combined with this monopolizing of our provider care that's a real concern.
Well, yes, certainly the lack of transparency, and I've pointed to the case many times of the physicians group in Oklahoma City that rather famously was touted some years back, and I haven't heard much about them since then, who a group of doctors got together, opened an outpatient surgery center, posted their menu of prices online. And that is something that, in most hospitals, you have no idea what the cost is going to be until you get the bill. And it's frequently exorbitant. But regarding doctors and their affiliations with Sutter or with any hospital system, don't they have the choice to work somewhere else?
They do. They certainly do. I mean, doctors have to make those independent choices. They have to make it based on what care they want to provide, what care is available at that facility. There's a lifestyle choice, of course. They have to be in proximity to where they provide care. And so there is choices. You're finding I'm finding and speaking to a lot of doctors within the healthcare community, they're choosing to opt out by what you just described, which is to say that they have people who are affluent enough to be able to actually pay for any penalty, certainly with the mandate, the penalty that the government required, and then go and receive their care somewhere else because they are concerned about what kind of care they're receiving, and they weren't given the options or choices and the cost choices on what their care would look like, especially with things that are not deemed as essential, but more elective surgeries or outpatient kind of activity. And so that's already happening by what you described here in California, not just in places like Oklahoma. So it's happening.
Before we break here, just one last question. What is it going to take at the federal level to get this kind of, to open the market and open choices for patients to get what they want from healthcare? Where have we failed at the congressional level?
Oh, I think we failed because we have allowed way too much tax dollar provided health care to occur. We're at the point to where there's a lot of people who don't have any skin in the game. They are simply going to receive care. They're not paying for any procedure themselves. It's all being paid for, or almost all paid for, by the government. And so they don't care about the cost. And if you're a provider, because of the restraints on how much each procedure will cost based on which program you're involved with, what you do is you just increase volume. I can't make as much money on this one, but I'm going to do this 5 times and make more money, see a better return. And so we have to find a way to get tax dollars out of our healthcare system and move forward and open up that market to allow for care to increase across the entire threshold of what patient requirements are.
And as we've been pointing out since this whole process started, once government starts making healthcare decisions, the only way to control costs is to ration the care. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, as you point out, with no skin in the game, people are just going to consume as much healthcare as they want.
There is a scary term. It's a PC term now, but what it really is. It's called distributive justice. Are you familiar with that term, Phil? Okay. And that's where a bunch of bureaucrats might decide, you're costing us a lot of money to keep you alive. We're going to go ahead and send you a form letter and say, we're sorry, but you're going to no longer receive
here's the number for your local hospice provider.
That's a true piece of a future reality for single payer, for example, where the government just decides, you know what, probably not going to happen anymore. We're sorry. So
our guest is Andrew Grant. He is a candidate for Congress in the 7th District. He is a Republican, and we will have more with him. It's 18 past 8 here at AM 1380, The Answer. Twenty-two past 8. It's the Capital Hour here on the Phil Cowan program, and our guest is Andrew Grant, candidate for Congress in the 7th District here in Sacramento. In the eastern part of Sacramento County. It's my district, as a matter of fact, so this is of some interest to me.
Phil, can I have your vote?
Check back with me at the end of the hour. Check back with me in June. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was national defense and foreign policy, because you were a military guy.
Yep.
Attended the Naval Academy and had a career in defense intelligence.
Yep.
This president, again, has taken a little harder negotiating line with regard to international relations. He appears to be certainly more dedicated to firm national defense. We're spending more money on the military now. From your perspective, Andrew Grant, are we in a better place in terms of foreign relations and national defense than we have been during the last administration?
There's no question we're showing more leadership. Sometimes when
which is interesting you say that, because people on the left will tell you the problem is that America's not showing the international community leadership anymore, Phil, and I think we're showing more than we have in a long time.
When there's a policy ascribed to a president of the United States which says we were choosing to lead from behind, okay?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not certain what that is. And so
I don't even know what it means.
Yeah, it's a little hard for me to figure out too. So, but the bottom line is we're showing a lot more leadership. Some of the things I think that kind of run through his mind is the reality of now being president, right? When you hear that someone's using chemical weapons against their own citizens, you're reacting, you're emotional, you're angry that that's happening, and you have an ability to provide a response. And I thought his gut response, and I think that's where that came from, and I'm certain calculation in every decision he makes, but his gut response to actually go ahead and attack in Syria the last time was the smartest thing to do. That can't happen. That can't stand. We have entire regimes through the United Nations and through other coalitions that have said with law and with the support of the strength of the free nations of the world that those stuff can't happen. It won't stand. And yet here we did nothing about it the last time. To find out that we thought we were removing all the chemical weapons from Syria to then be used, to then someone actually doing something about it. And so I think his calculus in terms of his gut has been good for us. He's dealing with some real intractable issues, though. We've been in Afghanistan for 12 years now.
Yeah.
And are we in a better place right now than we were before? Certainly we had to respond post 9/11. But where is the democracy, this nascent democracy in Afghanistan going? No one is really too sure. The reconstruction efforts are important. Supporting the Afghan Defense Forces is important. But at the end of the day, without the support of Pakistan or other countries in the region to make this work, where will we be in the future? I'm not too sure. And so, it's very hard for someone perhaps with the experience I have to say flatly, yes, we're in just a better place than we were, because each day comes with its own new challenges.
Well, and regarding the situation in Syria, and I'm not sure it's all that unique in the Middle East, quite honestly. I think there are a great many people with a voice in these matters who think they know a whole lot more about what's going on there, Andrew, than we know.
Yeah.
John McCain, the classic example. No, I've met with these freedom fighters, and they're wonderful. And then we look at the photo of the people he met with, and half the people in the picture are identified as Al Qaeda operatives. Yeah. The players in this drama, I'm not sure where there's a good guy, and you sometimes wonder whether the president's isolationist bent might not be the best course of action here.
Yeah. Yeah, no, same thing with Korea, right? I always remind people, because I worked on the Korea problem as an intelligence officer, I always remind people that there's communication going on within the Korean peninsula. Korea First Peninsula, Koreans talking to Koreans across that border, a lot more than what we understand or realize. And there's cases to where the South Koreans were making decisions, and yet at the same time, we're responsible for U.S. Forces Korea. We actually have the highest seat militarily on the peninsula, and yet decisions were being made militarily that were South Korean decisions right under our noses. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of conversations going on. There's a lot of stakeholders. We used that word before, but there's a lot of stakeholders involved in what happens in places like Syria and North Korea, the Korean peninsula in general. Going back to Syria, though, for one case, Russian involvement to me is of the most deep concern. Here's why. I think there's a play here that Russia's saying, you know what? We will intervene less. We'll let Assad go if you let Ukraine go. I think there's a play here by Putin to negotiate in terms of what his tactics look like.
A Trumpian play, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Play this gentleman the same way he'll try to play me, because ultimately I think that's what Russia wants more than what they want in Syria. And so there's definitely some play going on, and I would say geostrategically with Korea as well for the Russians and their involvement too in that process. So I think there's some definite things that are going on that are not said every day, but relatables that are important for making final decisions and what the outcomes will look like for the future.
Is there a sense, as Russia makes these plays, that there is a growing sense of desperation on the part of the Russians? Their economy is not in good shape.
It's not.
And we have hurt it badly with our increased energy production.
Yeah, Senator McCain, same gentleman, also said, and I think he's right about this, he said, you know what, Russia's just one big gas station.
Yeah,
that's really what they provide in terms of their economy. All the oligarchy is based on being involved somehow in fossil fuel sales. That's how they make money. And so if that runs dry, or if we can compete, especially with natural gas, where we are competing and winning along with other nations, that's going to be a real challenge for Russia. And I think you're seeing some of the reverberation in the decisions they're making. But you're right, their economy is in big trouble. But look, when you have a 74% voter along with an 80% favorable rating, I mean, you're not going anywhere for a time. So
any American president would lust for that.
That's right.
It's 8:29, and our guest is Andrew Grant, a candidate for Congress in the 7th District. We've got a break for news here. We'll have more with Mr. Grant right after this.
The check on traffic and weather coming up. Right now, we're going to throw it back to Phil, back to the Phil Cowan program on AM 1380, The Answer.
Thank you, Dave. 8:37. We have one more segment here to spend with Andrew Grant, congressional candidate for the 7th District, currently occupied by Dr. Ami Bera. Andrew, of course, running as a Republican. One of the things I want to talk to you about, because I know you're still a family guy with the young kids at home, school-age kids. I was fortunate enough to live in a community where the public schools were pretty good, and my kids did fine. But there are plenty of places here in not just in California and in the Sacramento area, but across the country where public schools are not serving our kids the way they should. What needs to change in public education?
Yeah, just despite the highest per student cost, right? I mean,
exactly.
Something's going on here.
And you're considerably younger than I am, but the cost on a per pupil basis in adjusted dollars vastly more than when I was a boy, and it hasn't gotten better.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on with the entire education system that concerns me. I don't think that, for example, or for just understanding what federal role we have, that it's a federal solution. I think a lot of what happens with education has to be very localized and made by people who really know what's going on.
Is there a role for a federal Department of Education, do you think?
I think there's a limited money role. I think there's an overarching, if you're actually going to appropriate money towards the country for education, there has to be an overarching, let's call it oversight role, and degree of accountability, because that is federal tax dollars, people who made that money, who gave it to the government to use correctly. By the way, it's not the federal government's money, it's the taxpayers' dollars that are used to support, right? And so I think there's a certain rule, but within that framework, it really comes down to the state and local responsibilities to use those dollars appropriately. And I do think that merit-based teaching is critical. I think we find ourselves, and maybe you felt the same way when you were being educated, that some of the teachers weren't doing their jobs every day. They didn't care as much, and I think that reflected in the lack of real interest in support of the students that were in the classroom every day. There has to be a constant review process to make sure we have the best teachers in place to provide the best education possible. I think the role of parents' involvement, I think what's happening now is some people are just seeing going to school as almost like going to your babysitter. And there's not a parent and family accountability within our education system.
Well, and that's
not a government thing.
No,
that's a societal issue.
It's a social thing, and it is a damaging trend that is going on right now. And I've pointed out many times in where I live in Folsom, one of the big differences is, where my kids went to school at the elementary school, and thank goodness we only lived about a quarter mile away, and we could walk on back to school and open house nights because there was no place to park.
Yeah.
The place was packed.
Yeah,
and
you had that there.
You don't see that kind of parental involvement and response in at-risk neighborhoods, if you will. And that lack of parental involvement, not only does it lead to, I think, bad behaviors on the part of some kids, it also leads to a very unfulfilling and unhappy experience for the people that go there with the best intention to teach those kids.
True. Totally agree with you.
And I don't know how we get past that.
Yeah. I've shined the light on some of the teachers that are, I'd say, more challenged or perhaps shouldn't be in the positions they hold. There's so many who should be, and they're doing great things for students every single day. I mean, they go to work with that badge of honor and with the dedication to the students that they're teaching. The other challenge I think we're facing is that the entire system, in my view, is almost completely geared towards a 4-year university education. And if you don't get to that level, then what happens, right? Have you failed? And even the community college systems are geared towards feeding into some local university or state program. What about workforce development that focuses on those vocational skills, focuses on workforce development that actually provide a good paying job right out of high school, with then the decision later, if you decide, and you have money to pay for it, a 4-year education. I think there's a great track of opportunity there that we're just not focused on as a society. And I think the education system needs to realize there's a lot more opportunity out there to move into a good paying job without incurring a huge amount of debt in a 4-year program first.
I would agree wholeheartedly, and I think the loss of vocational education in public education has been a huge one. You know, when I was a kid, there was a metal shop and a wood shop and an auto shop on every campus. And now we don't do that, as you point out, either in high school or at 2-year schools, yet we invest billions of dollars in job training programs that employ almost no one.
Local businesses are actually starting to do this themselves. They're realizing they can pay for this. They can bring people into a track that gives them a certain skill set to move into careers in their particular business or industry. And so they're sort of taking on this role. If we can find an additive using tax dollars to support that kind of business operation, I think we're going to do far more for our future for our students than what we have in place right now. And let me go back on one thing that we talked about, which is trade and the question around, U.S. built content versus Mexico or Canada or other places. I think you're going to find a relationship between our ability to manufacture and move into not just common manufacturing, but high-tech manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, things that really sell globally, by looking at workforce development in a more holistic way and focusing on some of these vocational skills. I think that's the kind of track we have to look at.
And it's an education model that is being employed quite successfully in Europe and elsewhere.
Yeah.
That's the dual track that they've had kids on for a long time. Is it time, do you think, if we took some of the dollars we currently invest in university education and started investing in the other track, is it time to maybe starve the university monster a little bit?
Either starve or place a set of requirements on the university to make available those kinds of options too. I mean, these are massive bureaucracies, large organizations who can do more than one thing. Maybe we charge our university systems to have a second track that they're responsible for. And find a way to sort of bifurcate that responsibility, or we make it independent. But yeah, there's some way to where all the money going to these university systems, and here in California, in fact, it's the most expensive thing, and it's a majority of our budget that goes to our education system here for the state of California. Here we have a real opportunity to realize this option.
How big a role do you think for-profit trade schools and their lobbying dollars have played in this dynamic?
It's hard to say.
I don't think it's insignificant.
Yeah, no, I don't. I couldn't pin a percentage or an idea to it.
It would damage them if we started teaching these skills in public schools.
It could. It certainly could. But you know what? Giving options to make more competitive the range of opportunities for students, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I think you'd see a response coming from the private sector where there are even more opportunities, or perhaps advanced opportunities, or by select industry opportunities. I think adding competition is always a good thing. We talked about healthcare before. Adding competition is a good thing.
You bet it is.
It lowers the cost and increases the options for people who need it.
And well, it usually gets you a better result in the end.
It does.
No question about it. Before we go, one more question, and we brought up taxes earlier, and you brought up tax reform, and we're happy with 21%. We're glad we got that on the business side, certainly on the corporate side.
Right.
Would you like to? I know that President Trump has talked about going to phase 2 of tax reform, and I know our other sitting congressman up in District 4, Tom McClintock, was advocating, let's do corporate taxes now. Let's come back next year and deal with individual taxes. Would you like to see further reform on the individual tax side?
I would, but here's the challenge with all of this. You can't say that, and I know Congressman McClintock had his concerns around the recent omnibus bill. You can't say that, but then still pass a $1.3 trillion budget.
And he and I had that discussion before when we were talking about the bill as it was being negotiated, and I said, look, if people are worried about revenue neutrality, that says to me, Tom, it isn't a tax cut. You're just shifting where it comes from. And he said, well, obviously, you're right. He said, and the answer is, if you're worried about revenue neutrality, is you spend less money.
Yeah.
But we don't appear to be prepared to do that.
Before we move into a phase 2, I think we go back to the original Trump administration budget and look at that closely. What Congressman Barra said was, that thing is dead on arrival. No one's going to support that. But if you look closely at what he was trying to accomplish, and if you actually know government a little bit, and you realize that some of the savings that we could make through that, it's not entitlement, and that's where most of the money's parked, right? But it's certainly a lot of programs and activities that our federal government is doing now that we could do less of, to find a way to realize, without all incurring the debt, phase 2 of whatever tax program we want to look at, then I see that as real opportunity. I did not see that first budget as dead on arrival. I saw that as the Trump administration negotiation position, like we talked about what he does.
Point, you bet.
And let's work on that, on reducing our debt. We'd have to move to 5 or 6% economic growth, sustained economic growth, to pay for another tax reform. Now, I'd love to see it. I just don't know if it's in the cards. But let's look at how much our cost is first before we decide to find a way to relieve more people of these taxes. But I do think it needs to be part of that future conversation, no question.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can find out more about Andrew Grant at andrewgrantforcongress.com. That's his campaign site. I encourage you to go and read up on the gentleman, and I'm sure he'll be out in the district pressing the flash and knocking on doors.
I am running and walking.
Best of luck to you, and thanks for
Phil.
coming in here and doing this. I appreciate it.
You bet. Great to be here.
8:48 now, 12 minutes before 9, AM 1380. The Answer. We'll be back in a minute. Say goodbye and hand it over to Dennis.